I've been doing sleep for a few decades. I got my first sleep job in 1991. I worked in a neurology-based office in my first lab, and then when I moved to Denver, I went to National Jewish. I have worked subsequently at Exempla, St. Joe's, and Lutheran. Alpha Sleep, which is an independent sleep lab, where I was a lab supervisor. I was at Rose for 11 years, where I was primarily the day scorer, which freed me up to pursue some other interests, including my master's degree in organizational performance and change. And I've been able to use some of that workshop facilitation stuff in my part-time job. But I've been a registered sleep technologist for over 10 years. I was qualified to sit for it long before that, but it's a test that you do a practical, you do a in-depth examination to verify that you know in some depth what's going on with sleep. So sleep is something that we can't live without. It is a drive, just like hunger, thirst, sex. At a certain point in life, we technically could get by without sex, but the species cannot. And just like those other drives, we can do lots of things to impair our sleep. But if we continue to do that, we will build up sleep debt. We tend to underestimate the impact of sleepiness on ourselves until we're falling asleep while driving or while trying to pay attention to something that we need to pay attention to, like our children in the bathtub or things like that. Sleepiness can be a significant impairment. The Chernobyl, the Exxon Valdez, all happened as a result of sleep deprivation. They happened on the night shift when people were sleepy and didn't have adequate response times. So what is sleep? Sleep is not just a total shutdown. It just means that your brain is operating in a different way. It's still active, it just is active differently. So to demonstrate that, I'd like to show you this TED Talk. And from a neurological perspective, this is fascinating.
Sleep. It's something we spend about a third of our lives doing. But do any of us really understand what it's all about? 2,000 years ago, Galen, one of the most prominent medical researchers of the ancient world, proposed that while we're awake, our brain's motive force, its juice, would flow out to all the other parts of the body, animating them, believing the brain all dried up. And he thought that when we sleep, all this moisture that filled the rest of the body would come rushing back, rehydrating the brain and refreshing the mind. Now that sounds completely ridiculous to us now. But Galen was simply trying to explain something about sleep that we all deal with every day. See, we all know based on our own experience that when you sleep, it clears your mind. And when you don't sleep, it leaves your mind murky. But while we know a great deal more about sleep now than when Galen was around, we still haven't understood why it is that sleep, of all of our activities, has this incredible restorative function for the mind. So today, I want to tell you about some recent research that may shed new light on this question. We found that sleep may actually be a kind of elegant design solution to some of the brain's most basic needs, a unique way that the brain meets the high demands and the narrow margins that set it apart from all the other organs of the body. So almost all the biology that we observe can be thought of as a series of problems and their corresponding solutions. And the first problem that every organ must solve is a continuous supply of nutrients to fuel all the cells of the body. In the brain, that is especially critical. Its intense electrical activity uses up a quarter of the body's entire energy supply, even though the brain accounts for only about 2% of the body's mass. So the circulatory system solves the nutrient delivery problem by sending blood vessels to supply nutrients and oxygen to every corner of our body. You can actually see it in this video here. Here we're imaging blood vessels in the brain of a living mouse. The blood vessels form a complex network that fills the entire brain volume. They start at the surface of the brain, and then they dive down into the tissue itself. And as they spread out, they supply nutrients and oxygen to each and every cell in the brain. Now, just as every cell requires nutrients to fuel it, every cell also produces waste as a byproduct. And the clearance of that waste is the second basic problem that each organ has to solve. This diagram shows the body's lymphatic system, which has evolved to meet this need. It's a second parallel network of vessels that extends throughout the body. It takes up proteins and other waste from the spaces between the cells. It collects them and then dumps them into the blood so they can be disposed of. But if you look really closely at this diagram, you'll see something that doesn't make a lot of sense. So if we were to zoom into this guy's head, one of the things that you would see there is that there are no lymphatic vessels in the brain. But that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? I mean, the brain is this intensely active organ that produces a correspondingly large amount of waste that must be efficiently cleared. And yet, it lacks lymphatic vessels, which means that the approach that the rest of the body takes to clearing away its waste won't work in the brain. So how then does the brain solve its waste clearance problem? Well, that seemingly mundane question is where our group first jumped into the story. And what we found as we dove down into the brain, down among the neurons and the blood vessels, was that the brain's solution to the problem of waste clearance, it was really unexpected. It was ingenious, but it was also beautiful. Let me tell you about what we found. So the brain has this large pool of clean, clear fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. We call it the CSF. The CSF fills the space that surrounds the brain, and waste from inside the brain make their way out to the CSF, which gets dumped along with the waste into the blood. So in that way, it sounds a lot like the lymphatic system, doesn't it? But what's interesting is that the fluid and the waste from inside the brain, they don't just percolate their way randomly out to these pools of CSF. Instead, there is a specialized network of plumbing that organizes and facilitates this process. You can see that in these videos. Here, we're again imaging into the brain of living mice. The frame on your left shows what's happening at the brain's surface, and the frame on your right shows what's happening down below the surface of the brain within the tissue itself. We've labeled the blood vessels in red, and the CSF that's surrounding the brain will be in green. Now, what was surprising to us was that the fluid on the outside of the brain, it didn't stay on the outside. Instead, the CSF was pumped back into and through the brain along the outsides of the blood vessels. And as it flushed down into the brain along the outsides of these vessels, it was actually helping to clear away, to clean the waste from the spaces between the brain cells. If you think about it, using the outsides of these blood vessels like this is a really clever design solution. Because the brain is enclosed in a rigid skull, and it's packed full of cells, so there is no extra space inside it for a whole second set of vessels like the lymphatic system. Yet the blood vessels, they extend from the surface of the brain down to reach every single cell in the brain, which means that fluid that's traveling along the outsides of these vessels can gain easy access to the entire brain's volume. So it's actually this really clever way to repurpose one set of vessels, the blood vessels, to take over and replace the function of a second set of vessels, the lymphatic vessels, to make it so you don't need them. And what's amazing is that no other organ takes quite this approach to clearing away the waste from between its cells. This is a solution that is entirely unique to the brain. But our most surprising finding was that all of this, everything I just told you about, with all this fluid rushing through the brain, it's only happening in the sleeping brain. Here, the video on the left shows how much of the CSF is moving through the brain of a living mouse while it's awake. It's almost nothing. Yet in the same animal, if we wait just a little while until it's gone to sleep, what we see is that the CSF is rushing through the brain. And we discovered that at the same time, when the brain goes to sleep, the brain cells themselves seem to shrink, opening up spaces in between them, allowing fluid to rush through and allowing waste to be cleared out. So it seems that Galen may actually have been sort of on the right track when he wrote about fluid rushing through the brain when sleep came on. Our own research, now it's 2,000 years later, suggests that what's happening is that when the brain is awake and is at its most busy, it puts off clearing away the waste from the spaces between its cells until later. And then when it goes to sleep and doesn't have to be as busy, it shifts into a kind of cleaning mode to clear away the waste from the spaces between its brain, the waste that's accumulated throughout the day. So it's actually a little bit like how you or I, we put off our household chores during the work week when we don't have time to get to it. And then we play catch up on all the cleaning that we have to do when the weekend rolls around. Now, I've just talked a lot about waste clearance, but I haven't been very specific about the kinds of waste that the brain needs to be clearing during sleep in order to stay healthy. The waste product that these recent studies focus most on is amyloid beta, which is a protein that's made in the brain all the time. My brain's making amyloid beta right now, and so is yours. But in patients with Alzheimer's disease, amyloid beta builds up and aggregates in the spaces between the brain cells instead of being cleared away like it's supposed to be. And it's this buildup of amyloid beta that's thought to be one of the key steps in the development of that terrible disease. So we measured how fast amyloid beta is cleared from the brain when it's awake versus when it's asleep, and we found that indeed, the clearance of amyloid beta is much more rapid from the sleeping brain. So if sleep then is part of the brain's solution to the problem of waste clearance, then this may dramatically change how we think about the relationship between sleep, amyloid beta, and Alzheimer's disease. A series of recent clinical studies suggest that among patients who haven't yet developed Alzheimer's disease, worsening sleep quality and sleep duration are associated with a greater amount of amyloid beta building up in the brain. And while it's important to point out that these studies don't prove that lack of sleep or poor sleep cause Alzheimer's disease, they do suggest that the failure of the brain to keep its house clean by clearing away waste like amyloid beta may contribute to the development of conditions like Alzheimer's. So what this new research tells us then is that the one thing that all of you already knew about sleep, that even Galen understood about sleep, that it refreshes and clears the mind, may actually be a big part of what sleep is all about. See, you and I, we go to sleep every single night, but our brains, they never rest. While our body is still and our mind is off walking in dreams somewhere, the elegant machinery of the brain is quietly hard at work, cleaning and maintaining this unimaginably complex machine. Like our housework, it's a dirty and a thankless job, but it's also important. In your house, if you stop cleaning your kitchen for a month, your home will become completely unlivable very quickly. But in the brain, the consequences of falling behind may be much greater than the embarrassment of dirty countertops. Because when it comes to cleaning the brain, it is the very health and function of the mind and the body that's at stake. Which is why understanding these very basic housekeeping functions of the brain today may be critical for preventing and treating diseases of the mind tomorrow. Thank you.
So there are different stages of sleep, and different stages of sleep are going to have different changes in the body. So we will see different hormone secretions. You'll see human growth hormone secreted during deep sleep. Just moving into light stages of sleep, you'll see changes as the body starts to relax and repair itself. We look at wake as a stage of consciousness, and then the other stages of sleep we have are light sleep, stages 1 and 2, deep sleep, stage 3, REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And we'll go in a little bit more depth about what each one of those look like. So this is a little bit of a blurry slide. I do apologize for that, but it's hard to find really good PDFs and images of these. So the top line up here is light sleep. So when we look at EEG, we're looking at it at a slower paper speed, even though we don't use paper anymore, than we do in a clinical EEG. So it's 10 millimeters per second. So typically one epoch of sleep is 30 seconds. So when we go through and score a sleep study in the lab, we're looking at between 750 and 1,300 pages per patient. And we're looking at these pages. And we look at amplitude or voltage, which is the height of your wave, and we look at frequency, which is the speed. So the top one shows a low amplitude mixed frequency waveform. The second line is stage 2 sleep. And we start to see some characteristic waveforms. This is called a K complex, kind of looks like a K. And the one over there in the box is called a sleep spindle. Typically, people who are on benzodiazepines will have increased sleep spindles. We believe the presence of sleep spindles indicates the brain's attempt to consolidate sleep and make sure you stay asleep. Sometimes we'll see K complexes followed by an arousal. So it seems to be that part of the brain that says, I'm still alive, but I'm not functioning, and there are things that are kicking in. This is deep sleep. This is stage 3 sleep, where looks like about 100% of that page is going to be in that really high amplitude or high voltage. So it's very tall waveform and very slow frequency. So typically 0.5 to 2 cycles per second. And then this bottom one is actually REM sleep, which, as you can see, looks a lot like stage 1 sleep. And we'll talk in a little bit more depth about why we think that is and why that's important. So this light sleep stage, particularly stage 1, if someone wakes you up out of stage 1, you're just as likely to say, I wasn't sleeping as I was. It's more like dozing. So you're not always sure you were asleep if you're just in stage 1. People who have fragmented sleep because of sleep disorders a lot of times will have a much higher percentage of stage 1 than we'd like to see. It's not particularly refreshing. It's more of a transition. Stage 2, we start to see that slower frequency. Typically, if you wake somebody up out of stage 2 sleep, they will know that they were sleeping. So this is a good example of a page of stage 2 sleep. This person appears to have some arousals going on. So this right here, where it looks fast and dark, that's an arousal following these periods of K complexes. Not really clear, pretty looking spindles on this particular patient. This shows what all we look at. So we're looking at typically 6 wires for different parts of the brain. So we usually look at the central, the occipital, and the frontal lobes when we're scoring sleep. These 2 are eye movements. This is chin tone, so we typically put 2 or 3 electrodes on the chin. We do that because we need to differentiate between wakefulness and sleep. So this will go down, the width of this will start to taper off as you go into relaxed sleep and you don't have as much muscle tone that you're carrying. When we go into REM sleep, we're paralyzed, and so this line will flatline. We typically look at EKG. We also look at oxygen saturation typically, and leg movements, although they're not on this one. So deep sleep is associated with deep physical rest. If someone wakes you up out of stage 3 sleep, you will know that you were asleep. Sometimes you can have what we call sleep inertia, where it's just really hard to open your eyelids because you're so tired. If you take too long of a nap and you're just like, I just can't, I'm so tired, and you feel tired like that for the rest of the day. It is typically associated with the release of human growth hormone. So children have a lot more deep sleep than adults, and that continues to decrease as we age. This is a good example of what stage N3 sleep looks like. The other thing that happens in this stage besides the EEG is the basic vegetative functions. It's really about this deep physical repair in this sleep stage, and so the breathing gets very stable. Even somebody who's got, for example, significant sleep apnea, when they go into stage N3 sleep, that kind of levels out and it's not as bad. Somebody who's really severe with sleep apnea or something like that typically doesn't get to this stage of sleep. But when they do, their breathing normalizes, their oxygen levels stay stable, their heart rate stays stable. It's just a a unique feature of sleep, and that's when they say you sleep like a baby, because babies and little kids have lots of this. REM sleep is the sleep that is associated with dreaming. In the early literature, it was referred to as paradoxical sleep because, as I already showed you, that EEG looks very much like, this looks very much like wakefulness. But the eyes are moving back and forth. And if you look at the brain, this activity, this fast cortical activity is actually concentrated in the occipital lobe, which is associated with vision. And then your eyes are moving back and forth. Different neurotransmitters are being secreted in the brain. Your muscles are paralyzed. Your sympathetic nervous system is activated, so your heart rate typically goes up. Your breathing gets a little bit less stable. It is associated with this mental rejuvenation. So people who don't get good REM sleep frequently have issues with increased irritability, difficulty remembering things. It seems to be kind of like doing a defrag on your computer, that sleep stage. It's kind of like when if you're running your car on idle, you know how periodically it's a good idea to kind of rev the engine a little bit just so that it runs smoothly. It's kind of that same kind of function in the brain. So healthy sleep occurs in 90-minute cycles. So from the time you go to sleep in a healthy, normal subject, we would typically see one stage of sleep, one cycle of sleep. So that means you would typically go through stages 1 and 2, go into a period of stage 3, and have a brief REM cycle. So this is what it looks like if we try to graphically illustrate that. So the black bars are REM sleep. And this one indicates stage 3 and 4. We used to have stage 3 and 4, which are both deep sleep. We just changed it to N3 because it's easier to score and have score reliability. But as you can see, as you progress through the night over the course of the hours, you have less of the deep sleep and you have more of the REM sleep. So for somebody who is chronically depriving themselves of sleep, they're going to be chronically depriving themselves of REM. So for a lot of people, we all struggle to get enough sleep. You can't just say, oh, you get 5 hours, you need to get 8. They're not going to do that. But you can start to talk about these cycles and say, you know, if you can get 6, that's better than 5.5. If you can get 7.5, that's probably better than 6. Just to try to increase that, and if even that's difficult, say try to get an extra half hour so that you can start to increase your chances of getting the type of sleep that you need. This is a talk by Charles Czeisler, who used to be at Harvard and is now the director of the National Sleep Foundation.
I'd just like a little bit of a show of hands here to find out how many people here feel that they've gotten an adequate amount of sleep over the past month. Do I see any hands? A couple of hands. Well, like most Americans, the people here are simply not getting enough sleep. I'd like to ask one other question. How many people have never driven a car when you are drowsy? 2 people, okay. Yeah, well, that's reflective of all of our lives these days. The question that I'm going to pose is, why are we not sleeping as much? 10 times as many people today are sleeping less than 6 hours a night than, for example, when I was growing up. If we look at kids of all ages, 5-year-olds are getting 2 hours of sleep less a night than they did in earlier times. 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 20-year-olds, we're all sleeping a couple of hours less per night than we did in the past. So the question is, why are we sleeping less? And I think one of the key issues is actually the light to which we are exposed. And that may seem surprising, but electricity and the ability to turn it on whenever we wish, along with caffeine and other aspects of our technological lives, are actually reducing the amount of sleep that we have. And paradoxically, in order to understand this, we have to understand how sleep is organized within the usual day. And we have 2 major regulatory processes that affect how alert we are at any given moment. One of them is related to how many hours that we've slept and how long we've been awake. And the second is an internal clock in the brain that times sleep and times our tendency to feel alert and our tendency to feel sleepy. And paradoxically, that internal clock in the brain sends out a stronger and stronger drive for waking as the day wears on. And it opposes what would otherwise be an increasing drive for sleep the longer that we're awake. And this reaches a real apex near the end of our waking day. And we just have this internal clock sending out this strong signal to keep us awake. And that's when we get this second wind near the evening part of our day. What turns off this orchestrated increase in energy and alertness is the release of the sleep-promoting hormone melatonin. And that hormone is typically released an hour or two before we go to bed at night. But that release of the hormone can be suppressed by light, and it can also be shifted by light. So light exposure in the evening can not only suppress the release of that hormone today, but make it occur later on subsequent days. And I first learned what a profound effect this was having when we made the discovery a few years ago that some blind people who have no conscious light perception, that their internal circadian clock can be shifted by light that they can't see. And that's because just in the same way that the ear has two functions, one is for hearing and the other is for balance, also the eye has two functions. One is for seeing each other, and the other is for circadian photoreception, or resetting this internal clock. And so in this individual, even with his eyes covered, he has no ability to sense the light and also no response hormonally to his being exposed to light. But when his eyes are exposed, even though he is completely blind and unable to see the light, it immediately suppresses the release of this sleep-promoting hormone melatonin. But the amazing thing was when he lived with sighted people, we realized that the timing of this hormone was beginning to be released. The secretion of this hormone was being released at 11 or 12 o'clock at night. Whereas when he became an upperclassman at Boston College and got his own room, suddenly you notice that he was beginning to release this hormone in the afternoon, and it was actually reaching its peak at midnight. And it made me reflect on the fact that midnight is called midnight because it's actually the middle of the night if you were to look at the timing of the sun rising and setting. But of course, many people today are just beginning to check their email at midnight, start their homework, begin writing that novel, and taking on all sorts of other challenges and not even beginning to think of going to sleep. And so I actually went to an area where there is not electricity. It is about 5 hours outside of Curitiba, Brazil, where I managed to find a home where there were no electric lights. And I went to visit the parents of that family, and there were 7 children. One of the things I was curious about was how they managed when it got dark at 6 o'clock in the evening. The mother said, well, typically we go to bed. So I said, what do you do if a child wakes up? Because they're in this one room with a dirt floor, and all 9 of them are sleeping in this room. And I'm thinking, if we had to sleep with our kids and whatnot, chaos, pandemonium. And so I said, what do you do when it's dark and the kids wake up during the night? And the translator back and forth, Dr. Luzada, asking over and over again my question in different ways. And finally, the woman understood the question, and she said, we never wake up during the night. The children, we go to bed at dusk, and the children wake up at dawn. And I realized that the artificial light to which we're exposed is wreaking havoc on our ability to remain in sync with the 24-hour day. And I began to then look at the results of our laboratory experiments. We had studied hundreds of people in which we defined the daily rhythm of light sensitivity. And here you can see that light exposure in the evening hours resets our internal clock to a later hour, and light exposure in the morning is resetting your circadian system to an earlier hour. And that's how we keep in sync with the 24-hour day. As I mentioned, the second wind is lined up to occur late in the evening to allow us to stay awake for this marathon 16-hour wakefulness that we all experience each day. And then I was thinking about what must it have looked like 200 years ago, or what would it have looked like in this blind individual who was living in his own room and didn't have electric light. We would expect the daily rhythm of light sensitivity to take this shape. The melatonin would be released, as it was in his case, at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So the second wind would actually be taking place when we're all running to get a coffee break and so on. The artificial light to which we're ordinarily exposed has pushed the circadian system to a later hour and shifted us to the equivalent of Hawaiian time, shifted our brains westward, placed this second wind late in the evening, and squeezed the timing available for our biological night, because we're still getting up with the chickens. In fact, the biggest segment of the working population in terms of its temporal distribution is for jobs starting between 3:30 and 6:30 in the morning. So the jobs and the work are starting earlier. Our kids are going to school earlier. We're making the high school kids start at 7-something in the morning, even though 100 years ago they didn't start till 9. Kids back then didn't even use alarm clocks to get up for school. How many of you never used an alarm clock to get up when you were going to school, like 95% of the kids did at that time? So we've created this big squeeze. So we have this early wake time, the circadian surge in wake propensity, and it's an unintended consequence of artificial light. And then when we add in caffeine, many people don't realize that it has a half-life of 6 to 9 hours. So when we take it after dinner, it's going to interfere with the restorative value of sleep that we would otherwise get. The function of sleep is to repair and reorganize the brain. Sleep is critical for learning. In fact, we integrate the knowledge that we've learned today with our prior experiences, and we rehearse places we've been and routes that we've taken and so on during the night when we are asleep. It is also the time that we get insight. Now, if we don't get enough sleep, we're one of the few animals that deprives ourselves of sleep. And most other species, the only time that they're sleep deprived is when they're not getting enough to eat. And so the two systems are intertwined. We want to eat more if we're not sleeping enough. If we go on a diet and try to restrict our calories, but we're also restricting our sleep, then 75% of the weight that we lose is lean body mass rather than from fat, because of the changes in the hormonal environment that occur when we're not getting enough sleep. If you sleep for 4 or 5 hours a night, even for a week, men's testosterone levels drop to the same degree that they would having aged 10 years. So it has many different effects. It increases distractibility. Kids become hyperactive. Paradoxically, they don't become sleepy, but they have difficulty focusing attention. And we all become a little bit hypomanic. We don't quite become manic, but we get this feeling of euphoria. And that may be why sleep loss is associated with burnout, depression, and other adverse mental health consequences. And we're sleep depriving our kids. You know, they're spending 8.5 hours a day on recreational media if they have a TV in their bedroom. And it turns out that they're spending more time doing that than sleeping. So it's no wonder that they're hyperactive. 1 out of 10 12-year-old boys is now diagnosed with ADHD. So what to do? To thrive, you have to decide if sleep is a priority, establish a regular bedtime, establish a regular wake time, find a cool, dark, quiet place to sleep, and make your bedroom a technology-free zone, because it's going to interfere with your ability to sleep. Get rid of the caffeine, get rid of the alarm clock, and find out how much sleep you really need, and then try to get that. And what could be the benefits? First of all, you're going to be able to concentrate so that you can perform better, you can be more accurate. You'll have greater insight. You'll have faster reflexes, reduced risk of injury. You optimize your metabolic fitness and your appetite, enhance your immunity, decrease your risk of infection, reduce your risk of diseases like diabetes and stroke and cancer and heart disease. Ben Franklin, famously, in the Poor Richard's Almanac said there'll be sleeping enough in the grave. One thing I can tell you is that you'll get to that grave sooner if you don't sleep enough. If you want to thrive while alive, sleep. Thank you.
So he was talking about circadian rhythms. Dr. Seisler's done a ton of work on the circadian rhythm. The rhythm itself is dampened and shifted a bit due to aging, but light cues also have a significant impact on this approximately 24-hour cycle. He talked about the gentleman who's blind, long-term studies they've done on people with no light cues. We actually cycle a little bit longer than 24 hours, but the light helps us reset. So we do things like artificially manipulate the clocks for daylight savings times. It throws our bodies out of whack a little bit. The fall change is better than the spring. There's a huge increase in accidents the Monday after that we switched the clocks in the spring. Because people are just sleepy and their bodies haven't made that adjustment. And we'll talk a little bit about specific disruptions and how you can have a pattern of disruption to circadian rhythm as a sleep disorder. So when we look at what optimal sleep is, he was referring to get rid of the caffeine and the alarm clocks to find out how much sleep you really need. Many people say, I just don't need that much sleep. I'm fine with 6. But if you actually take away those aids that are supporting their 6-hour sleep habit, most people are not short sleepers. There are very few people who are what we call short sleepers who do not require more sleep. So what we want to see in optimal sleep is typically 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep that you wake up naturally without an alarm clock. Usually you wake up out of REM sleep. That's what we see, and we see those 90-minute sleep cycles, no disruptions to breathing out of the norms for normals, no other things that prevent us from getting all the stages of sleep that are relevant to our stage in life. As I alluded to earlier, young children have a ton of deep sleep just because they're growing so rapidly. And so they have a lot of that delta sleep. Infants actually only have 2 stages of sleep. They have active and quiet sleep because even their REM sleep has this huge amplitude. So it doesn't look like what even childhood sleep looks like. As we move through the toddler stage, that starts to tighten up a little bit and we get more of that mixed frequency stuff. As we move into older patients, the sleep tends to be more disrupted. They spend the same amount of time in bed, but not as much in deep sleep, and their sleep tends to be more fragmented. But that's usually secondary to other other health conditions like heart problems, pulmonary issues, chronic pain. Those kinds of things prevent that deep restorative sleep, in addition to just general aging. In the sleep lab, I've seen people who were 40 who were invested in their illness who had the sleep of an 80-year-old, and I've seen 80-year-olds who had sleep EEG of a 40-year-old. So it is individual. It is going to vary depending on what's going on. The best brain waves that you see in older patients are people who are actively engaged in life, who are doing lots of volunteer work, have lots of hobbies, get out, are active. They tend to have younger looking EEG. People who tend to be more sedentary, have mood disorders, and are on significant medications that will alter their EEG. So we use the term sleep hygiene because a lot of people don't have great sleep hygiene. Sleep hygiene is useful for everybody, but in particular for people who are having trouble sleeping. This is a great place to start addressing some of their concerns. So you need to have a good environment. A good rule of thumb is it should be like a cave. It should be dark, cool, and quiet. So no TV, no stimulation. A noise machine can be useful for some people who've got external environmental noise issues, like they're too close to a busy highway or something like that. Just to have a steady stream of background noise is better than to have that rushing by of the semi trucks in the middle of the night. Dr. Seisler talked about the caffeine. It does have a long half-life that most people are not aware of. It's about 7 hours is a good cutoff to say I'm not having caffeine. If I want to go to bed at 10, nothing after 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Alcohol close to bedtime can help you fall asleep faster for some patients, not all, but most. And you do go to sleep and sleep pretty well for the first hour or so, and then your sleep is fragmented for the rest of the night, regardless of whether you do it consistently every night or if you just do it occasionally. It has that kind of an impact on your sleep quality. Again, for people who really struggle with issues falling asleep and staying asleep, having that same bedtime and wake time every day can really be useful. It has to do with that circadian rhythm as well, to say this is what time I'm going to bed. And to treat it as a wellness issue and say this is something that's important to my overall health. I need to be strict about this and say, you know what, I know you want me to watch this movie, but I'm going to bed because I need to have good functioning tomorrow. I need to be alert. And then to be aware of the impact of medications, in particular things like benzodiazepines, SSRIs, your selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, can have an impact on what sleep stages we have and when and what they look like. Narcotics as well. They can help somebody fall asleep because they've got chronic pain, but it can also depress the respiration. They have what we call hypoventilation sometimes, where they're just not taking very deep breaths, and particularly at altitude where we tend to have a lower baseline saturation level anyhow. It can put people into the 80s for their baseline saturations and lower. So for people who do have trouble sleeping, some of the first things they can do behaviorally is turn the clock away from you. And most people who have trouble sleeping are inveterate clock watchers. You know, if I just fall asleep the next 5 minutes, I'll still get 4 hours of sleep. Increasing their anxiety and making it more difficult to fall asleep. And this seems counterintuitive, but do not remain awake in bed for more than 20 minutes. And I know I just said don't have the clock where you can see it. But we all know what about 20 minutes feels like. And most of us know that feeling of ping, I'm not going to go to sleep. And sometimes it's because I'm worried about stuff that I need to deal with tomorrow and how am I going to get to the place I don't know where I'm going. Get up, print out your map, you know, or use a dim light. Don't turn on every light in the house. It's okay to sleep on the couch as opposed to lying awake in bed. So the TV in most living rooms is further away from you than the TV in our bedrooms, just because of space. The light in the bedroom is not so good. We want your bedroom to be a place that is restricted to sleep and sex. So don't do your bills, don't talk to your accountant, don't talk to your lawyer about your upcoming divorce in your bedroom. Don't do any of those things. But there will be people who say, well, I'm resting in bed, isn't that better? Well, you're associating your bedroom with not sleeping. So behaviorally, you walk into your bedroom if you have trouble sleeping on a regular basis and go, oh God, I hope I can sleep tonight. What if I can't sleep? And then you already have that anxiety. So if you have a pattern to say, you know what, it's not one of those nights, I'm gonna go sleep in the spare room, I'm gonna go sleep on the couch, I'm gonna turn on Whale Watchers or something boring, or I'm gonna read that book that I could never finish in college. Don't go to the thriller. Don't go to the exciting, you know, action-packed movie that you've been dying to see. Well, I'm up anyhow, I might as well watch it. Those are things that will make it more difficult to get the rest that you need. But to say, okay, I'm gonna go find something narrated by Richard Attenborough, you know, about nature. That's perfect. Then you can go to sleep. Or for me, mummies. Mummies are great, you know. They're, you know, archaeologists taking the dust piece, but it knocks me right out. And the cognitive behavioral therapy is actually a really effective way to help people who are having chronic issues with insomnia. In fact, it's got longer-term benefits than medications such as Ambien. It's hard to get people to accept that it's going to take a little bit of time to adjust, but they learn the strategies to stop these self-defeating thoughts and behaviors and have a strategy. A lot of people say, well, I can't control my thoughts. We actually can. We just aren't practiced at it. So if I say, can you imagine a tree in a field? Got it? Just controlled your thoughts. So it's as simple as that. How do I have some different strategies? And yes, the first few times you get there, you'll go, oh, I remembered I wasn't going to do that anymore. And that's progress. Just remembering that I was going to do it differently, even if I failed to get it right. I'm only going to talk briefly about this and go through these pretty quickly because we're going to cover snoring and sleep apnea in greater depth in some of the other presentation decks. Snoring is incredibly common. Most people who have sleep apnea snore, but not everybody who snores has sleep apnea. So it's important to ask these kinds of questions, and we'll talk about screening for people about this. When we're looking for obstructive sleep apnea, which is very common and really severely underdiagnosed, if you have somebody who's sleepy during the day or they're fatigued, that's when you can start going, okay, maybe we should ask some questions. Do you snore? And do you have those crescendo snores that get louder as we go along? That's what sleep apnea sounds like. Or you have the long pauses. Most of us have an uncle who would fall asleep at Thanksgiving and fall asleep in the recliner, and there'd be those periods of silence followed by the and that's an apnea. So if they have those, have them come see us. Hypertension and cardiac symptoms are very common in people who are first going, oh, I think I might have a problem. It has to do with the fact that when your body's trying to wake you up from those occlusions of your airway, it increases your blood pressure because you're not getting the oxygen you need, and the brain has to wake up a little bit to get you to take that breath. Mood disorders such as depression and anxiety, to some degree bipolar disorder, and diabetes are also highly correlated with obstructive sleep apnea. So this is an example of what obstructive sleep apnea looks like when we're monitoring it in the sleep lab. So as you can see, this is somebody who is in stage 2 sleep, mostly this low frequency mixed amplitude stuff, some of these K complexes here and here. Where it gets really dark here is an arousal, and it follows this obstructive apnea. So this is airflow here, these guys in the blue. This is effort, this is snoring. So here's this guy here, snore, snore. Oh, as he exhales, his airway collapses. He's trying to breathe, his oxygen drops, has a big snort and arousal, and goes back to sleep just seconds. This is a period of about 3 seconds right here, and then goes right back into stage 2 sleep. So most people are unaware that they're doing this. We tend to be horrible historians of our own sleep anyhow because we're unconscious. But this is why they're like, I sleep fine. Because they're not aware. They don't wake up enough to go, oh, I just stopped breathing. But that oxygen drop, the increase in heart rate that followed it, have significant long-term effects on our overall health. It doesn't typically kill you quick. So that's why somebody can come into the sleep lab and say, you ask them, do you snore? Yep. How long have you snored? 40 years. Do you stop breathing at night? Yep. How many years have you been doing that? 30. And you're like, how can you still be walking around? But those consequences build. So they say, well, my hypertension's treated. Yes, with medication. If you would breathe all night, you would probably not need as much of that. Cardiac, right-sided heart failure, cognitive impairment, which is a giant umbrella for things from the mood disorders, difficulty concentrating, increased irritability, difficulty remembering things. And as Dr. Iliff talked about in his talk, a possible link to dementia such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. However, untreated OSA can kill you quick because it has been related to at least a 7-fold increase in car accidents. We can't definitively link to fatal accidents because if they're untreated or undiagnosed and they fall asleep, how do we say that was sleep apnea versus sleep deprivation? It's just hard to do that forensically, but we can say probably we'd have a decrease in accidents if people were treated adequately and effectively for their sleep apnea. So treating sleep apnea, we use positive airway pressure, and we'll talk in more detail about this later. We use oral appliance therapy, which moves the mandible forward or keeps it from falling back. Surgery includes bariatric surgery for people who are significantly overweight. A 10% decrease in weight usually leads to a 1-degree improvement in sleep apnea. So if you're severe, you can take it to moderate, or if you're moderate to mild. But it is difficult sometimes with bariatric patients who think that if I just lose the weight, I won't have sleep apnea, I don't need to treat it. It does have impact on their ability to tolerate the surgery. It affects narcotic use if they have sleep apnea. And typically they're not going to go from severe to no sleep apnea, even if they lose a significant amount of weight. Positional devices are for people who just have sleep apnea to a significant degree on their back. And so you can have them sew a tennis ball into their sleeping shirt, or you can, there are bands that you can put on. We used to say get a backpack and fill it with styrofoam, but I don't know anybody who's ever done that. And then the weight loss that I alluded to. Other surgeries that we can do for sleep apnea are tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy, especially for children. I had that for my mild sleep apnea, but my tonsils were about that big. And my sleep apnea was very mild. They used to do a lot of what they called UPPPs, UPPPs, which is to remove the uvula, part of the soft palate, and some of the pharyngeal tissue. But the long-term outcomes were not great. Side effects in some cases included when you swallowed, the food would come out your nose. And you can't put it back. So that's why most of these other therapies are things that if you stop using them, you go back to the way you were. An oral appliance, you can have some issues with TMJ or bite changes. Positive airway pressure, typically you get short-term dryness and congestion, but claustrophobics have a hard time tolerating it. So we think healthy sleep more and more is demonstrated as one of the 3 pillars of health, along with good exercise and nutrition. It is still difficult culturally to get people to accept that and say, yes, I'm going to make it a priority that I get good sleep. But the more we can move the needle to get people there, I think the more we'll see improved outcomes for people. All right, questions?
How often do you feel that somebody that is obese and significant type 2 diabetes that dies in their sleep might be related to an untreated OSA?
Well, the first question I would ask somebody was, did they snore? And if they did, it really makes it much more likely. You know, the way OSA works is that as I showed you on that one slide, the brain has to wake you up just enough to kick the reflex back in to open the airway. And, you know, it's like the brain's going sleep or breathe. And the brain's pretty smart and usually is going to choose breathe. But you get to a certain level of fatigue and the brain just goes, no, I just need to sleep. And you don't wake up. And there are plenty of cases of people with sleep apnea who are untreated and who die in their sleep. So it is probably more common than we know because there is such a low incidence of proper diagnosis and treatment for this condition, partly because we underemphasize the importance of good sleep and also because we think of snoring as just a social disorder instead of it's probably linked to other stuff. So as part of the way I do this, there's a quiz in your packet. This is quiz A. So I'm going to have you go through those and answer those questions, and then we'll discuss what the answers are and any questions that you might have or a way that you understood it differently. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. So why do we need sleep? A, so the body can repair itself. B, so the brain can repair itself. C, so hormones can be released. D, all of the above. All right, what's the answer?
D.
That is correct. All right, what are the stages of sleep?
And 1 and 2 and 3 in REM.
Very good. Circle the correct response. Light sleep has higher or lower amplitude?
I put higher.
It would be lower amplitude. So amplitude is the height of the wave, and so light sleep is that short stuff. And higher or lower frequency? Higher frequency because you're going to see more cycles per second, so it's faster. Okay. If awakened from deep sleep, how does a person behave? A is alert quickly, B is groggy and confused, C is able to describe the dream he or she was just having, D knows he or she was asleep, or some combination. B and D is groggy and confused and knows he or she was asleep. What sleep is associated with dreaming?
REM.
Correct. Sleep occurs in how many minute cycles? 60, 90, 120, or 30?
90.
90, very good. What is the best length for a nap based on what you know about sleep cycles?
20 minutes.
That's right. Out of the choices that you have, 20 minutes is the best length because you don't go into that deep sleep and you don't wake up groggy and confused, but you do have enough time to get into some stage 2 sleep. If you have the time to do a 90-minute nap, well, then you might get some REM and then you'll be okay. But 2 hours, you're probably going to go back into that deep sleep. In healthy sleep, the second half of the night has a greater percentage of what kind of sleep? Allison? That's right. Our daily cycle of sleep and wakefulness is called a what cycle? Circadian rhythm, yes. When is our body temperature the lowest? 6 p.m., 1 p.m., midnight, or 3:30 a.m.?
3:30.
That is correct. Has anybody here worked the night shift? Yes. And so what happens when you're at 3:30 in the morning? What happens to you?
Cold and tired.
Yes, and you wrap yourself in a blanket to get warm, or you put on your coat and then you're like, oh, I can't stay awake. And it has to do with that circadian rhythm, that our body temperature starts to drop around 10 or so, and then is at the lowest at 3:30. It starts to come up again. Just plan ahead. There's another little dip at about 1 p.m. So after lunch, when you've had all that food and all your blood's helping to digest and you get a little cool, you might get a little groggy. So that's why I'm going to try to keep this interesting. Optimal sleep. Fall asleep in how many minutes? Yep, 20 or less. But 2 means you're probably a little sleep deprived. Guilty. Sleep for how many hours?
7.5.
Yep, 7.5 to 8. And awaken from what stage of sleep? REM. Typically, people who are just on therapy for sleep apnea, when they finally get to that place where they have a good night's sleep and they wake up out of REM, that's when they go, wow, I feel better. But it takes sometimes a few weeks to get there. Why do adolescents fall asleep later in the evening than children? A, melatonin is secreted later, or adolescents need less sleep than children. What do you think? A. That's right. Melatonin starts to become secreted later, and then we add to that the use of those handheld devices, which also bumps that melatonin secretion to later, and it makes it more difficult for those adolescents to fall asleep. Adolescents actually need more sleep than children, which is why it's not good for them that we have them chronically sleep deprived. Other than normal aging effects, why else might the elderly have poor sleep? Medication use, pain, cardiac issues, all of the above.
All of the above.
That is correct. What should the sleep environment be like? Doesn't really matter. If you're sleepy, you can sleep anywhere. Dark, cool, and quiet. It's soothing to have the TV on, or extra warm.
Dark, cool, and quiet.
That's correct. In my case, it's A, but that's okay. What activities are appropriate in the bedroom? Sleep, checking Facebook, sex, running budget numbers, A and C, or all of the above?
A and C.
Very good. How many hours before bed should you stop caffeine?
7 hours.
7 hours. True or false? Alcohol helps you fall asleep faster. True. Doesn't help you sleep better, but faster, yes. True or false? You need a clock next to your bed to be sure you get enough sleep. False. When you have trouble sleeping, you should stay in bed, so at least you're getting some rest, get up after 20 minutes awake, check the clock repeatedly, or watch that movie you've wanted to see. Allison?
Get up after 20 minutes.
Very good. True or false? If you snore, you have obstructive sleep apnea. False. You might, but not definite. All of the following are signs and symptoms of obstructive sleep apnea except daytime sleepiness, snoring, low oxygen levels during the day, witness pauses in your breathing, high blood pressure, mood disorders, and diabetes. C, low oxygen levels during the day. Typically, if you have that, there is an underlying pulmonary condition that may or may not have anything to do with how you sleep at night. True or false? Insomnia is not linked to obstructive sleep apnea.
True.
It's actually false. They did a recent study with people who are drug-resistant insomniacs. 91% had sleep apnea. The key question if somebody has insomnia, there's 3. Do you wake with a dry mouth? Do you have morning headaches? Do you get up to go to the bathroom more than once a night? Those 3 questions can help you go, you know what, I think maybe you need to be checked for sleep apnea. Then you can start asking them things about hypertension and snoring and age and weight.
Give
But,
it 3 questions again.
the 3 questions are, do you wake with a dry mouth? Do you have morning headaches? Do you go to the bathroom more than once a night? PAP stands for, oh, this is tricky because I didn't say this specifically. Polarized arterial pressure, positive airway pressure, posterior activation paresthesia, or positive airway positioning.
Positive airway pressure.
That is correct. You win the prize. You get to stay all day. True or false? Oral appliance therapy is a first-line treatment for severe OSA. That is false. That's right. It is a first-line treatment for mild to moderate sleep apnea. It is not a first-line treatment for severe sleep apnea, especially if you're using insurance companies. They usually require you fail at PAP first. What are the treatment options for OSA?
All of them? Oh.
That is correct. All right, very good. How would you like a little break?
Sure.